Good morning. In the year 1645, there was a particularly peculiar, one can say, controversy that erupted in Italy. We've already gotten to know some of the controversies in Italy, but you could say this one is something special. This controversy began in the city of Senigallia. Senigallia is on the back of the boot of Italy, so to speak, on the Adriatic coast, across from Croatia, countries like that. The next nearest biggest city is Ancona. And in Senigallia, the Machlekes erupted on the first day of Sukkot of the year Tav Vav, when a number of young men decided that they wanted to, the shul should sing the Kedusha of Keser together. Because the minhag of Italy is that Chazaras Hashatz, Kedusha starts with Keser for Shachris, Musaf, and Mincha. So they started singing Keser together. But they actually said, they repeated the word Keser 2 or 3 times to add insult to injury. And this caused a major eruption. A number of the people in the community were upset. The local Rav, his name is Rabbi Shmuel Karkas. You may be familiar. It's a big Spanish mishpacha. You may be familiar with Mari Karkas, Pirush and the Rambam. So all from that, generally the same family. So the Rav of Senigallia, Rabbi Shmuel Karkas, expressed his protest against the choir. The choir was led by someone by the name of Mordechai of La Rocca, Mordechai de La Rocca. But the people that put this project together ignored the protests, and in fact, they had the encouragement of a different Rav. The Rav's name was Shmuel Yitzchak Nortzi. Nortzi is Italian Yiddish mishpach, also a lot of Rabbanim. He was the Rav of La Rocca, and he happened to be in Senigallia at the time. And there's a lot of familial relationships between people there, but Shmuel Yitzchak said it's fine. You can ignore your Rav. So tensions are being heightened. So imagine this. So essentially, what's the controversy, right? Today you're in shul and everyone wants to join together and sing kedusha together, keser and kaimcha, whatever it is. But apparently in Italy in 1645, this was a major scandal. Of course, it's not mamish quite the way we sing in shul today. It's just a bunch of people singing the same song together. Here it sounds like there was a choir, there were harmonies, there was a little bit more of a production, but still. So I'm going to continue with this story, but I'm using the story essentially as a way of introducing the general question of the halachas involved in singing during davening, particularly if it's involving a choir. And the biggest question of all, is it permissible to bring musical instruments into davening in shul? Nowadays, you'll find here and there, maybe even in this community, that you have the vart that people do Hallel with music. It's a bit of a fad right now, especially if it's more of a Kirov minyan. The people are a bit on the outs and strumming the guitars and playing the flutes. So there's actually a very long history of fighting over bringing musical instruments into shul. Of course, the particular details of each case matter. But that's what I want to discuss. And we're beginning with this case in 1645. So let's go back to the story. So the Parnas Rashi, the leader of the community, his name was Moshe Matrizi. So he turned to a Rav by the name of Rav Nesanel Trabot. He was a Rav in the city of Modena, not particularly close, but I guess he was a very chashuv Rav. They reached out to him. He's also related to some of the players in the story. So he wrote a letter to the Reish HaKehillah dated Hey Cheshvan Tav Vav, Now, this Rav and these tshuvas are not exactly world famous household names. In fact, as far as I know, they've not been printed properly. So I can't, usually when these tshuvas are quoted in secondary sources, I like to go back and see the tshuva and original source in full. But I can't do that in this case. But we're relying on a shortened version that appeared in an academic article about this Reb Nisan al Trabot. It was printed in Sufot, Volume 2, in Tafshim Ches. And over a page or so, the author quotes the highlights passages of this from this controversy in short. So we're relying on his rendition of the material. So he wrote in this letter that Yafa also habachrim hamazamrim lenagin kedushas musaf k'dei lahader Hashem. It's very nice, beautiful that you're singing during musaf. However, even though in principle it might be okay, but he leaned towards taking the negative position for three reasons. Number one, people who aren't familiar with the rules of music will find it strange that words are being repeated, because that seemed to be a given, that if you're doing this kind of musical production in the style that was popular in Italy, there had to be repetition. So people that aren't familiar with how this is all being put together, they're going to find it strange. And he says that there's a rule, there's value to simply not stirring the pot and not doing things that some people find strange. And number two, this is part of the debate as well, what is the significance specifically of the word keser? Is it just a nice word that, we're trying to praise Hashem with the keser? Or does keser have deep Kabbalistic meaning? And if you repeat the word keser a number of times, it's almost like you're implying, the shtei reshuyos, the shalosh reshuyos, how many kesers are there, how many gods are there? So that's another question which we want to avoid. And number three, your own Rav, Shmuel Karkas, said that he's opposed, and that is enough of a reason. Kavod HaTorah, v'afilu ma'yameira, omer al yamin shu smile. Not that he's necessarily applying that as a consistent halachic rule, but at least for rhetorical flourish, you have to listen to your Rav, no matter what he says, even if it doesn't seem so logical. And Nisan will apologize that he's essentially involving himself in their dispute, but he said, I'm related to a lot of you. LaRocca family, so he's dafka, even though the LaRocca family is related to him, he's dafka coming down more on the side that opposed this musical production. Now, we still have this Rav, Shmuel Yitzchak Nartzi from LaRocca, who's still supporting and defending the musicians. So he responded to this letter and he wrote to Rabbi Nisano that the story isn't exactly as you were told, this and that. So Rabbi Nisano replied again, and he said, look, in principle, I am not opposed on any level to involving music in the davening. And I even am willing to accept and agree that there will be some repetition in the course of the music. But Keser in particular, Keser is Remes L'Keser Elyon, and it's problematic. And further details from this letter, Masana writes, it's also problematic that the Rav Kurkus apparently changed his mind. At first he said it was okay, first he gave his approval, then he backtracked, which Rav Kurkus later denied himself that this is actually what happened, but that was the information Nisan had. He also, since we already went through the whole saga of the mikveh and Ravigo, so it does make a cameo here. Rav Nisan mentions that, remember that machlekes. What was part of the reason for that machlekes? That the Rav first was matirit, and then he backtracked, and then he answered it. If he had answered it to begin with, the mikveh, with the kalim, with the holes, to fill up with the holes, as we all hopefully recall, for those who were at the Shiur. So the Rav first invented it and was matir, and then he answered it. So if he hadn't done that, there wouldn't be a problem. So the same thing would be true here as well. Why be matir something and then answer it? If you would have said no to begin with, maybe this whole thing wouldn't have happened. You wouldn't have this controversy right now. And this is the source. He seems to indicate that dispute in Ravigo ended up costing the community a lot of money when the authorities got involved in some way. Anyway, so Rabbi Sanel is more or less holding his ground that he's not really supporting this thing in practice. The music lovers, meanwhile, reached out to other Rabbanim in Venice and Pizarro, and those Rabbanim said it's okay, and even to repeat the word Keser. A few days later, both Chachamim in Senegalia, both Rav Karkas, who's against, and Rav Nortzi, who's pro, wrote against Rav Nasano. Keep on reaching out to him. Rav Karkas asked Rav Nasano to issue another psak that unequivocally says that it's not okay. And Rav Nortzi was trying to prove that singing during davening in Italy is already an old minig, and you're allowed to even repeat Hashem's name, apparently, according to in his opinion. And that many Rabbanim already from Venice, that we mentioned, and others have already explained that Keser is just a praise for Hashem. It's not reference to Hashem himself or to Spheres. And he's a little, he expresses himself a little mockingly towards those who are very concerned about the Spheres here with the word Keser. Anyway, and Nortzio. This was Shabbos. No mention of musical instruments explicitly here. Just the choir. That itself sparked the whole dispute: the singing, the choir, and the repetition. And Rav Nortzi mentions proudly, apparently, that when Rav Nassanel had written his letter against, and the Parnasim had decided to go along with that, they would try to prohibit it. Those in favor of the music had reached out to the authorities to overrule the Parnasim so they can continue doing their performance. And when the Parnas Matrizi was able to appear before the local judge, justice, the magistrate, whatever it was called, and to convince him that they should allow the Kehillah to make its decisions, so how do you overrule, how do you appeal on top of the magistrate? So they went to the local bishop. So that's how tense things were getting there. Anyway, Nasana wrote a third psak and repeated again. Why are you doing things against people's will? Without the askama of the Mara Asra and Bechal, we shouldn't be matter strange things. And even if it's mutter, it just seems strange and silly to the people that don't get your whole musical performance. So in a sense, what we're seeing here is already the two sides of the question, even though it didn't involve musical instruments, but this is in a sense is a microcosm of how these discussions go. On the one hand, is there really technically a problem? On the other hand, there's a lot of emotions around it, a lot of societal implications around it, and that alone could be a reason for Rabbanim to be in opposition. A few other interesting details from this correspondence earlier in the article mentions that when this dispute erupted and Nassanel's writing these shuvas, so he actually mentions his wife in the course of the shuvas. He writes, "It's true, shekachu haminig b'muzika loymar ezer dover gimel pa'amim." It's true. We know that if you're doing things musically, you do have repetition. As we see from the works of Reb Shlomo Meho Aduma, we're going to get to that in a moment. And then he adds, ishti maras Yudita Meho Adumim. And my wife, Yudita, also, she was musical and there was repetition, and he mentions Meho Adumim, so she seems to be related to the musical authority he just mentioned a moment ago. And then another tshuva in the course of this correspondence, he writes, Shahoisa chachama gedola umaskeles bekinor v'ugov umizameres b'muzika kedushas kaser. She was very musical on the various instruments, and she used to perform kedushas kaser. So that's at least some reference here to musical instruments, although lav dafka, it's implying that it was in shul. That could have just been on her own time. So who is Shlomo Meho Adumim that he's mentioning? So Shlomo Meho Adumim, in Italian or in English, she's known as Salamana Rassi. Rassi is the Italian version of the name. Meho Adumim is the Hebraicized version of the name. It's the same thing. So he lived from about 1570 to 1630. So he was an Italian Jewish violinist and composer, and he made it pretty big. in the music scene in Italy at the time. He was hired in 1587 as a court musician in Mantua, where we still have all the records of his musical activity there. He served at the court of Mantua from 1587 to 1628, a very long time. As the concert master, he was involved. He was responsible for the entertainment of the Duke and the family and the guests. You may have heard of a musical composer named Monteverdi. They overlapped together at the court of Mantua, among others. He published a number of musical works. Most of them were secular, but he's actually considered to be an innovator in Italian music and the history of classical music itself, Baroque music. So he started publishing in 1589, and he published many books starting in 1600. And those who understand music will understand, you can look up and see what exactly he innovated, what he contributed to music. But what's interesting to us is that in 1623, he also printed a sefer in Hebrew, which is what Rabbi Nissanel is referencing. He printed a sefer called Hashirim Asher L'Shleimai, based on Shir Hashirim, but in this case, it's literally the Shirim of Shlomo Rasi, Me'adum. You can actually find this on HebrewBooks.org. The music that he wrote, it's musical pieces written on tefillas and tehillim. It's written in the Baroque tradition and the musical style of Italy at the time. It is not connected to more traditional chazanas, whatever forms of chazanas they had independently at the time. This was it's still considered a big chiddush in synagogue music. In fact, it's said to be the first time in history where someone put together polyphonic music for shul. Polyphonic means you have multiple voices. So he, in the book, the musical pieces that he put together are designed to be sung by multiple people, multiple voices, harmonies. That's his chiddush, as it were. Now, of course, when we speak about all this and Italy in general, of course, you can't avoid the question of what influence or how much influence there is from the non-Jewish neighbors, the Christians, etc. In this case, we see that his career had mostly been secular before he turned to doing some Jewish works in the same style. At any rate,
he was from the Union.
I don't know to what extent exactly. How religious he was, whether he had a family. I didn't see any mention of family. Now, at the beginning of his sefer, the reason why I'm elaborating a bit on him is because his sefer is also related to this halachic question, or these halachic questions. This sefer was printed a little more than 20 years before the story that I began with. And before you get to the songs and the musical notation, there is a Torah Dika Hakdama about Nagina and music, Yiddishkeit. Most of it is written by a Rav by the name of Yehuda Aryeh Medina, Leon of Medina, Yehuda Aryeh, who his family name is Medina, as we see in Italy and other places. Often the place in your name is not where you're actually from, it's where your parents, your ancestors are from. He was mostly in Venice. Very colorful personality in the world of Italian Jewry, and to a certain extent, he's still controversial till this day. The Tzitz Eliezer, for example, one of his chuvas, savagely lays into Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh and condemns him as not an authority we should be taking any cues from. But certainly in his time, he was among the respected Rabbanim and Paiskim to a major extent. And in fact, in this case, the Rabbanim of Venice, some whose names you might be familiar with from Rovigo, were in agreement with him, so it's not that controversial. So it's printed in the beginning. You can find it in Hebrew books in the beginning of Hashem Asher L'Shleimai. It's also printed in the Shiur Chuvas Ziknei Yehuda of Yehuda Aryeh's Chuvas. So first he wrote a Hakdama to explain where this fits in, where this kind of music fits in the Jewish history. So he starts off and he explains that, of course, the history of Jewish music is long. We have David HaMelech, we have the Mizmorim of Tehillim, and all the names at the beginning of different Mizmorim. Miriam, of course, Parshas B'Shalach. We're just coming off of the Parsha of Miriam with the Tukim and the Mechilas. Tukim and Mechilas, specifically musical instruments, but yes, of course, Shiras Hayam, Moshe Rabbeinu.
He didn't have instruments. The ladies had this.
Yeah. Some say that they were just accompanying the men. Either way, we have this long history of music. of course, we have in the Bati Mikdash, Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni, and then, as the Chachamim tend to say, it's one of the areas of wisdom which we lost in the course of Galus. And he says that this is where our friend Reb Shlomo comes in. So Reb Shlomo, he is one of a kind nowadays, where we have just a little bit, even though we lost most of the Chachma, but we still have just a little bit, the trace remaining, and who has it? This Reb Shlomo. And not just among the Yidden, but he's really a sensation generally in the music world. And they compare him to the greats from past history. And he's already started his career with the not Jewish stuff, and now he's starting to branch into the area of Kodesh. And he's been putting out a piece at a time, and he releases it, and he shares it, and everyone is very enthusiastic about it. And until people said, we have to print this. So they decided to print it, and Budai is actually the Magia. He's reviewing all the material to make sure that it's correct. And he points out that, by the way, music is read from left to right, so the words, it's going to say Keser Yitnu Lacha, it's going to say Keser from left, and then Yitnu and Lacha. Because he says to do it the other way around, to put the music in the wrong direction is going to be way more confusing. And that's actually a standard that's remained till this day. Jewish music is still written from left to right, with the words and sometimes even the syllables written from left to right. And he says, the problem might be you might have these mischastim hamarchikim kol chadash, these goody two-shoes who reject all new innovations. So let me tell you, this is not the problem, and I'm going to copy a tshuva that I already wrote 18 years ago in Ferrara when there was some kind of controversy. So I'm copying and pasting it here, and I will copy and paste the haskamas of the Rabbanim of Venice who agreed to me at the time. So he quotes, and so then after the Akdama is over, there's 3-4 pages in Hashir Mashal Shleima of this halachic psak. That serves as the introduction to the Sefer, to the work. So the Shiur was again about a choir. We have a number of people who know something about music, 6 or 8 people, and on the Chagim and Moyadim, they want to do Hallel v'Zimra, Inkalikenu, Aleinu l'Shabeach, Yigdal, Adonai, etc. Classic pieces, L'Kvod Hashem, with a Seder v'Yachas, with harmonies. And someone was trying to shut it down, said that it's usher to do anything musical nowadays, b'chlal, because it says, and the Beis Midrash was destroyed, Al Tismach Yisrael Al Gil Ba'amim, it's a Gemara, I believe in Gittin, and so he's condemning these people that they're eisvarfs, they're crossing boundaries. So Yehuda Aryeh is standing up to defend them. And so he goes into this discussion essentially at length. So you have the Gemara in Gittin that they asked Marukva, how do we know that Zimra is Aser? So he was Mesartet, which is its own discussion of Sirtot. He wrote, Al Tismach Yisrael Gil Ba'amim. So he used this pasuk to say that this is the source for the Isser. Then the Gemara asks, why not use a different pasuk, B'shir lo yishtu yayin? And the Gemara says, if it just said that, we would think only musical instruments are a problem, but singing is okay. But when it says Al Tismach Yisrael Gil Ba'amim, somehow we know that even singing is not okay. So from this Gemara is mashma that the musical performances of all kind are forbidden, and this is actually quoted in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tafkuf Samach, and there's a famous tshuva of the Rambam. The Rambam has a very, very strict take on it. The Rambam seems to say that all music of any kind is prohibited. And then you have the Gemara in Saita, Udna, the Shama, Zimra, Ta'akar, an ear that hears music, bad things should happen, Zimra in a house, so Churban on the house. Then you have in Tanhedrin, someone who sings a pasuk from Shir HaShirim, it's a terrible thing. So you have all these anti-musical statements in Chazal. So he says, apparently that's the reason why this person said, Lei toiv adover l'shoder. But he says, a person like this, who doesn't know the basics, that of course, Zamar, the Dvar Mitzvah, is Mutter Gomer, So he must have, he starts writing these Lashonos, he must have read Mar Ukva's words while he was half asleep, and what the Paiskim wrote, he must have read L'Sirugin, and he's not examining the sources correctly. And he gets into, at length, to divide his different categories of music. The Gemara would divide it between musical instruments and singing, and then you have whether it's Mishteh Hayayin, at some kind of, you're singing at almost like at a bar or something like that. Or you have La'aneg Atzmi K'malachim, like the case with Mar Ukva. There was a Reish Galusa who was being entertained by the musicians at his court. So those are the more problematic situations. Then you have Chassan V'Kala, Dvar Mitzvah, or practicing in order to be able to perform for Dvar Mitzvah. So he makes the case at length that essentially the sources in Chazal are only about Mishteh Hayayin or La'aneg Atzmai K'Malachim. But if it's for neither, if there's some kind of tayalas, we see clearly in halacha in other contexts where it discusses chassan and kala, right? We know that it says in Shulchan Aruch that you can even hire a guy to perform for chassan and kala on Shabbos. Torah Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Shraga Dovid Homnick even for me to add, which goes back to the Rishonim. And he says, and we know, and it says in the Sfarim that Divrei Tushpacha is Shiur Shel Haidois and a Sudas Mitzvah. These are things we know that are established that are okay. So the problem is,
we don't do that nowadays. We don't hire music.
Right, we don't. But we don't really do weddings Friday night b'chlal. Back then, the minhag was they did the wedding Friday afternoon, and then the Suda went into Shabbos, and there was this heter.
But if somebody did have a wedding or something like this, so he could hire music.
Ask if you want to do it now. Ask a Rav. It's not hasn't been practiced. I don't think in a very long time. I don't even know if the Alter Rebbe might indicate that it's still practiced at that time, but it's been a long time. So his argument essentially is that it's only if it's Mishteh Hayayin, things like that, or the other Chazals about you're taking psukim and you're singing them as a love song, or you're singing actual inappropriate love song. So that's what all those sources are in reference to, but not stamazoi in a Yiddish mitzvah context. That would include davening in his opinion. So he says, I can't imagine anyone who has a mayach b'kadkadai to say that to sing Hashem, to praise Hashem in the Beis HaKnesses and Shabbos and Yom Tif, that should not be a dvar mitzvah, like being Sameach Chasam V'Kala. Yem simchaschem u'moyadechem. And we want the Chazan himself to do the nicest and most beautiful job that he can. And if he's allowed to, so what difference is it if I add 10 people backing him musically? What's the difference? It's just adding and elaborating and increasing that the beauty of davening. And he says, sometimes you have, he says, Ben Kilas Ashkenazim, it sounds like he's suggesting by the Ashkenazim, Lav Dafka, they had a full performance, maybe just a bunch of people are just joining in, singing on the spot, singing a tune together, they break out in a tune. Is that really a chet? Is that a problem? Kabbalas Hashem Mahoincha, and Migreincha, if you have a good voice. So if Hashem gave these people this knowledge, they shouldn't use it. It doesn't make sense. Should we be glazer on the shliach tzibur to do a bad job, to make sure that he's off key, to be noyer kachamor, because we're chayshish for getting too musical? Is that what you're suggesting? Is how he puts it. So Enoch will be an embarrassment to the other nations, which is always an interesting argument. So Seif Davar. There's no problem about Tismach Yisrael Gil. No one had ever thought that there was a problem with praising Hashem in a beautiful way. And of course, you have the sources about Misameach the Kala, Ketz Menach Lefnei Kala, and all that. So at Simchas Torah, they do that sort of for the Sefer Torah, right? They hold the Sefer Torah and they dance like at a chasana. So no one was ever moicha against that. And then it says another argument was it says Eich Nasher is Shir Hashem al Admas Nechar. That's also, come on, it's not that's not saying that you're not allowed to ever sing any music in any situation ever again. They were being asked to sing the Shirim, the Mizmainim from the Beis HaMikdash in the style they sang in the Beis HaMikdash for the entertainment of the Goyim, and they were saying that's not what we want to do. But that's it. So that was his argument. Tried to shorten it a bit. And then there are the Askamis of the Rabbanim of Venice. So the first one is Reb Tzion Sarfati. You may recall him. So this is these tshuvas are actually written about a year before the Svarim about the mikveh started being printed. The Svarim about the mikveh were printed in Shin Samach Vav, and these tshuvas are from Shin Samach Hey. So Rabbi Tzion Sarfati says, just like by the mikveh, they were quoting Reb Shmuel Yehuda Katzinel Boigan a lot. Who's Reb Shmuel Yehuda's father? Also very chashuv Rav Maram Padva. So in this case, Rabbi Tzion Sarfati says, I recall when I was young, when I learned in Padva, so it was a very chashuv city with the helm was Maharam, Reb Meir, Sheirarnu Beveis HaKnesses, Kol Seder HaKdusha. We used to sing the Kedusha together. We had the Seder of singing. And it was often at his request, at his behest, he initiated Maharam Padva. So it's no different than, certainly no worse, it's probably better than whatever music people are doing stam for no reason. In this case, it's for the Eibishter. So Tzion Sarfati signs his name, and Shin Samachei, Menachemov, Shin Samachei. And interestingly, who else? There's a few others, and who else agrees with him? The other major character that we know from the mikveh of Yehuda, Mifano Taisha Venezia, who wrote, which sefer was it? Was it Mikveh Yisrael, Pagimai? He wrote one of them, that was all his entire work personally. So he writes, if you don't understand music, then I don't know what to tell you, because everyone understands how great and important music is. As I wrote in my sefer, Shiur Tzion, so he says he composed this a sefer relating to music and Judaism. We don't have any other evidence of the sefer except from this Haskama, where I explained, based on Gemara, Midrashim, and Zayar, and Kabbalah, how important music is. So I'm asking to everything the Goyim wrote above. Ne'om Yehuda, Rav Moshe Mifano, Mitishavei Venezia. Interestingly, in the tshuvas of Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh, in that Sefer Zikra Yehuda, there's actually another tshuva in response to the Senegalia controversy, which we don't have in its entirety, but we can already imagine how he would have reacted, what he had to say about that. Obviously, he was also very much in support. Now, these Makaidas we're discussing are mostly talking about choirs and harmonies, but there are other sources that indicate, at least on a limited basis, there was also use of musical instruments in Jewish contexts in Italy over the centuries. In another article in Asufot Aleph by Meir Benayahu, where he was Malakat, where he got a lot of sources on this topic. So he printed some tshuvas. He actually printed for the first time some tshuvas from the year Taf Ayin Ches, about 100 years later, the 1717, 1718, where they wrote, Yilamdeinu Rabbeinu, there's a kat bachurim, there's a group of young men that gather Leil Shabbos, and they sing together poesia, so it sounds like they're singing some kind of poetry, and they have an ish nochri hametiv lenagam bekli shir hanikres gitara. So they have someone there, a guy who plays the guitar or whatever the guitar was like at that period of time, and he's playing for free, b'li kasaf, b'li mechir, and sometimes he even joins as a backup singer. And the question is this okay? They're doing this Friday night. This is a music club Friday night. And he printed the tshuvas of three Rabbanim. One Rav said that it's, first of all, Zimbra Asira, Gemara and Gittin, music itself is also. And Simon Tzad Shabbos, not okay. Another Rav said, even if it's mutter, it's the kind of thing you really shouldn't be doing, in that vein. And the third Rav sort of ignored the whole question and answered in the response of, come on, what's with you? It's Shabbos, deal with, go learn some Torah, do something more appropriate, like Kavod Shabbos. But so you see, on the one hand, people are initiating, people are starting these kinds of things. Rabbanim aren't necessarily so thrilled. A few decades later, you find other musical groups in Italy, and you even have a Rav B'Shmuel HaKohen of Modena, who mentions in his shuvas that they used to sing and perform on Shana Rabbah, the night of Shana Rabbah, and there's a whole question, as halachic shaila was, you have an oval, can the oval play one of the instruments? Because he played one of the instruments, and now we have a shaila, and he was matir. So you see how musical instruments as well, to one extent or another, were also creeping in, and part of how at least some Jews in Italy, expressed themselves. So again, we see the different sides and how this being pulled in different directions. So that's the chapter of Italy. Another place where there's a very old minig of music and musical instruments is Prague. This is a bit more well known. There's an article by Rabbi Shraga Dovid Homnick. He wrote about Kabbalah Shabbos in Kovitz Beisarim Yisrael, an issue from Tafshin Nun Ches. So he says there's already a source from 1610, 1620 that mentions that in Prague, Mekavim Shabbos bezimra v'shira bevat knesses bevat midrashei HaTorah, although it doesn't say clearly Klei it just says bezimra v'shira. There's also, not in Prague, but there's a piyut from a Rav in Vermaiza in Shin Peites, which is around the same time. It's the 1629, where he was metaken a piyut, his own original piyut for Kabbalah Shabbos, and the Keiseres, the title is Tikantiv L'Kvoid Ishti Shetanagin Oisei B'Klei Zemer. I made it for my wife to perform on instruments. So again, the wives are cropping up in these types of situations. The next source in Prague is a matzeva that was published as a matzeva from the year 1668. And on the matzeva it says, this person passed away on Friday, Chav Beis Sivan Tav Chav Ches. He was buried here. His name is Avram Klei Zemer. That was how he was known. Avram, the music guy. Gam hu haya echad mikat haklei zamorim hamakdimim lebeis haknesses b'chol eis leKabbalah Shabbos. And it notes on the matzeva that he was part of the musical ensemble for Kabbalah Shabbos. This is the famous minig in Prague to do Kabbalah Shabbos before the Zman with musical accompaniment. Then a bit later in 1678, there's I'm sure we all have heard of the Sifsei Chachamim and Rashi. The Sifsei Chacham and Rashi is compiled by an individual from Prague by the name of Shabsai Bass, or Bass, or his full name is given as Mishayer Bass. So in essence, his title is that he was a bass when they performed music. And he also printed a sefer called Sifsei Yeshanim, which I believe is like a bibliography of Svarim. And in the back, there's a Siddur Nusach Ashkenaz, and there the Seder Kabbalah Shabbos, and before the Chadoidi there's an extra song, another song that's not familiar today. And the Keseres it says, Zemer no mit Shloime Zinger, shemenagnim bekilas Prague, bebeis haknesses Meisel, beugov ubenevolim kaidem l'chadoidi. That's the caption from Shabsai Mishayer Bass. And ugov, as we shall see, ugov is the term that's used in the Svarim to refer to the organ, which is a very large instrument similar to a grand piano, although apparently it doesn't work exactly the same way. Piano is a percussion instrument, and an organ is a woodwind instrument. Who knew? So the ugav is going to become the center of later discussion. But he mentions that that's what they used in Prague in the basic Knesset Meisel. Rav Goldhaber cites other Makaitis about this period and proves that it wasn't only confined to Prague. Other cities in Bohemia, Nikolsburg, and places like that also had this practice, and there appeared to be no controversies. It was not controversial at the time. Then we get to the next stop on this train, which is the Reform movement. So then comes the Reform movement, and one of the big things they wanted to do was to set up an organ in the shul, which of course, you see the non-Jewish influence and the attempts to mimic what the non-Jews were doing. And they dafka wanted to do it on Shabbos, whether through a yid, with one way of arguing that it's mutter, or through a goy, another way of arguing that it's mutter. We already saw that technically you're allowed to get a goy to play music for a chas and kala, so there's something to talk about. And that's when it turned into a world war, so to speak. So it's hard to push and include all the history and all the discussions into one shiur. So I'm going to quote Bekitzer from different sources. So one source, it says, the modern organ in Reform synagogues was first introduced by Israel Jacobson in Berlin in a new house of prayer, which he opened for Shavuos in the year 1815. Taf Ayin He. And that created a tremendous backlash. And they actually started appealing to the secular sources. So in this case, the appeals were to shut down the music, and they appealed to the church. They argued that it's disrespectful for the church, that the Jews are stealing their shtick. And they also appealed to the Emperor Frederick William III. Things got very heated, and they actually managed to shut that place down for a few years. But of course, that didn't last very long. And in October 1818, they unveiled the first temple in Hamburg, and that's the beginning of the end. And one of the things they set up in the Temple of Hamburg was an organ, and they used a non-Jewish organist. The rabbi who gave his hechsher, so to speak, for these changes. So the first one was Eliezer Lieberman. He printed a sefer called Nega with his arguments. He also printed Nega HaTzadek, where he also roped in other famous early supporters, Aaron Chariner, for those familiar with Hungarian Jewish history, and Rabbi Moshe Kunitz, who is actually sort of on the gvul till today, how we view Rabbi Moshe Kunitz. At any rate, this is when they sort of pioneered the genre of reform shalos hatshuvos, or today we're more familiar with it as conservative shalos hatshuvos, where the still shtickle Talmidei Chachamim b'nei Torah, and they're trying to make arguments using Torah sources, but the logic and the types of arguments are of a certain type. And part of their argument was that they wanted to cite Italy and Prague as precedent of musical instruments being used in some capacity. Now, Yiddishkeit in Italy and in Prague at this point was also deteriorating, but there still were chashuva rabbanim relatively in both places. So the rabbanim of Prague sent a denial. They said that the minhag was always Kabbalah Shabbos before Shabbos, and they were always very careful to finish before the Zman. In Italy, the situation was a little more complicated because there actually was one Rav in Italy who wrote a heter, who said that he thinks it's okay with a guy or whatever. And that really made the Rabbanim in Europe very nervous, and that's what really got them up in arms to fight back. So they printed a kuntres called Eila Divrei Habris. You'll find it in Hebrew books. That has letters from Rabbanim far and wide, from Prague, from the Kiv Eger, from the Chassam Sefer, from a lot of chashuva rabbanim, some you heard of, some you haven't heard of. And I believe many of them are responding to this psak from Italy and trying to say, why are we even going as far as Italy? Why aren't there enough rabbanim over here? And then trying to get other Italian rabbanim to express their opposition. There's another kuntres called Tzirei HaChaim, also in Hebrew books, written by one individual, Avram Levenstam, where he wrote against this and many other topics that became an issue once reform were changing things. So I want to give at least a little bit of a sample from the halachic discussion. So I'm going to quote from a bit later from the Shalos HaTshuvos Melamed L'Hoyel by Reb David Tzvi Hoffman, Radatz Hoffman, who lived from 1834 to 1921. He's already one of the new Orthodox Rabbanim from after La'achar HaTzimtzum, already the new Orthodoxy in Germany, Shamshon Lefol Hirsch, and that school was Yul Hildesheimer. So he was the Reish Beis HaMedrash L'Rabbanim in Berlin, the Orthodox Beis HaMedrash L'Rabbanim, and he has a lot of scholarship on Gemara, on Halacha, on Mikra. He contended a lot with Bible criticism. For those familiar with his name, it's still a relatively famous name to those interested in that tchum. So he has a tshuva in Melamed L'Hoyel from the year 1897. The Shiur was in one of the cities, the Parnassim agreed to set up the organ. In German, the organ is called an orgel. So the Klei Shiur orgel hayadua, and the Rav there, even though he was against it, but he wasn't able to overrule. This is something we're familiar with from many, from the United States communities which were on the border, on the verge, and the Rav is not sure if he can overrule them. What should he do now? So he wanted to have a compromise. He wanted to say that, we can have the organ in the shul, but we'll only use it on weekdays for chasanis, which was its own controversy, doing weddings in shul instead of outside, or for the Yom Huledah Shel HaMelech, big event when it's the emperor's birthday. And he hopes that way, if he gets them to agree to that, otherwise, if he completely quits and bows out, then who knows what's going to happen? They'll get a different Rav and things will be even worse. The classic dilemma, the classic conundrum. But if he stays there, makes this compromise, then he feels he can keep it to weekday events. So the shaila is it okay to have an organ in the shul on a weekday? That's how far the question got. So he said, let's look back at the history. And this shuvah is already written in less of a traditional shuvah style, more in an article style, although not, it's still the Hebrew of the 1800s. So he says, let's look back to Tafkuf Ayin Tes, to 1819, when this whole thing erupted in Hamburg. He's very familiar with the history. Living in Germany, as he did at that time, you had to know the history backwards and forwards. And it was against the Badatz of Hamburg. This was a breakaway from the Orthodox, which before the word Orthodox existed, but before broke away from the Jewish community, traditional Jewish community in Hamburg. And the Beis Din collected all the psakim from the Gdei Ador, and they printed the Eilo Divrei Habris. And that kuntrus was against three issues, actually. One of them was the music on Shabbos. The other two was the Seder Atfilah and the language, the Lashon Atfilah. And all the Goyim had agreed that it was also to play it in Shul on Shabbos and Yom Tov even by a Goy. But the question we have here is, what about a weekday? If you look at Eilo Divrei Habris, you'll see that there's no consensus about it being a problem on a weekday. And he says, after I went through Eilo Divrei Habris, I can summarize that there are actually three different approaches. If you read between the lines, number one, some wrote stam, usher to do it on Shabbos and Yom Tov. They didn't address, they were focusing entirely on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and they ignored the question of choil. So maybe they hold it's okay on a weekday, or maybe they're not sure, maybe they didn't want to get into it. So he says that's the Badatz of Hamburg itself. Mishum Zalman HaKayin, the Big Kahuna, Rabbi Eliezer, the Shamnei Nekeach, Rabbi Avram Tiknon of Bresla, the Beis Din of Padua, Rabbi Kiva Eger, he quotes, said, Gam b'choil adayin ein a heter barer. Rabbi Kiva Eger threw it in. On weekdays, we're still not sure, because, who knows about music nowadays? That question has never been fully resolved for all Rabbanim. So all these Rabbanim, we're not 100% sure. Maybe they weren't, they didn't say it's okay. They didn't say it's not okay. Then number two, you have Rabbanim that said clearly that it's mutter b'choil, mainly Prague, where of course that was the minig, the uncontroversial minig for 100, 200 years. So the Beis Din of Prague, Eliezer Fleckels, Shmuel Landa, etc., and they wrote, Masher Menagdim B'klei Shir B'Shabbos Kodesh, Isser Gomeru L'Nagin, Amenagdim B'Kila Seinu B'Kabbalah Shabbos. The minig is that you have to stop Chatzi Shah Kainim Barchu. So clearly they thought it was fine. Also, the Rabbanim of Italy, the Rabbanim of Livorno, they said, "V'kulonu yachad asarnu iser lebilti yanagnu on Shabbos and Yom Tov Chas v'Shalom." We're only matir and Chol Hamoed and Erev Shabbos and Erev Yom Tov. That was how those Rabbanim were practicing it in Italy. He suggests that Prague was not matir the organ, but I believe other sources indicated they did use an organ, so that assumption there might be incorrect. And then number three, you have Go'enim in that country that said clearly that they think it's Aser, Sai B'choil, and Sai B'Shabbos. Reb Hertz Shiur said, Eich Nashir, Shir Hashem, that's what he cited. Chasam Sofer, and this is very famous and quoted in a lot of sources that discuss this. Chasam Sofer said that the fact that our ancestors, which of course is a very Chasam Sofer argument to make, our Zaydis never made Klei Shir B'Tfilah, even though, what do you mean, originally the Beis HaMikdash had music, and for some reason we decided not to replicate that and reproduce that in Shul. So Muzman Zagin, that it's take, they're against it. All the generations that didn't do this is because they thought it was wrong. Because once the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, there's no Simcha, Eich Nosher. And another Tshuva the Chasam Sofer, he said it's also Mishum Chukei Seyem, because one of the rabbis trying to be matir said it was not Chukei Seyem. So Chasam Sofer said yes, it is. You're imitating the non-Jews who have music in their prayers, in their services. Also, Mordechai Banet said it's Chukei Seyem, and Yesh La'asrei Akapanim Mitzad HaSafik, the Chavez Das, Rabbi Yaakov Lissa said it's Isser Gomer, Tamen Ugov, in the Shul, Bein B'choil, Bein B'Shabbos, and a number of others. He also quotes the Maria Sod, later on in Hungary, who was a Talmud of Mordechai Banet, who said that it's Aser on Shabbos. He actually doesn't mention that it's Aser B'choil, even though we just quoted the Mordechai Banet before. But could be that's Shaila was only about Shabbos, and he maybe Maria Assad is more in the first category where he's not sure or doesn't want to touch the weekday question. So that's his summary of the Eila David Bris. Then he says, next year in Tafkuf Pei, Rav Ram Levenstein put out the Sefer Tzarei Chaim. And he also said clearly in this kuntres, in his arguments, he said it's Aser Bein B'Chol Bein B'Shabbos V'Chukei Seim. And he says there's another work that probably would be harder to find now. He says in Tavrish Chav Gimel, Reb David Deitch of Zaroi in Silesian, which was part of Germany or one of the German countries at the time. Today it's part of Poland. He printed a German kuntres called Die Argel in der Synagoge. So a treatment, or more of a modern Orthodox, modern common Orthodox German Rav, writing a kuntres in German, where he also went through the whole shaila, and he said it's also on the weekdays, of course, of Chukei Sehem, and he quotes other Dayanim from Berlin who agreed, and at that point already was a Yiddish newspaper, the Israelite, so he's quoting from different issues of the Israelite, where of Meir Lehman, the famous Rabbi Dr. Marcus Meir Lehman, and others had also gotten into explaining why it was Aser. And they all agreed that it was Aser Bein B'Chol Bein B'Shabbos. This was a matter of principle for even for these German Rabbanim that in some cases met German culture at a certain point, but they were actually very extreme in their opposition to having the organ at all. We're talking about the organ. The organ is a musical instrument in the show. That's what we're talking about. This is the Reform controversy, the organ. That's the... no Orthodox Rav was Matar B'Shabbos except one Rav from Italy, which was already, Italy at that time was not so no Chashav Rav on the record that ever was Matar on Shabbos. We have the Rabbi Chassan Kala from the Rishonim that was quoted in Shulchan Aruch, but not the Shol Stamazeh. He says, V'chein b'havo heidah ne'amana. When a student is admitted to our base medrash in Berlin, we give a heidah ne'amana together with the Hataras Hairah. And on the list, I guess, of principles, if you're going to be a Talmud, the student of our Beis Medrash L'Rabbanim, one of the things on the list is no organ nor orgel because of Chukei Seim. So according to our own statement, it's also Bein B'Chol Bein B'Shabbos. And he quotes Psham Shel Falorish's Pirush and Vayikra, where Psham Shel Falorish managed to include the discussion, and maybe it's the pasuk of Chukei Seim Le'Selechetake, and he says that it's Aser Mishum Chukei Seim, and Tzvi Shchayas of Poland said it's Chukei Seim. Goes to other sources as well. He says, now I want to get into the question, because someone at Taina that you essentially had something very similar to the organ in the Beis HaMikdash. The organ is a woodwind instrument, and in the Beis HaMikdash there was a magrefa, which was some kind of complex wind instrument. That's it made multiple sounds. So they wanted to argue that if you have a magrefa in the Beis HaMikdash, how can you have a problem with this? So he gets into the Shaila of the magrefa, and there's a famous kasha with regard to the magrefa, because in Erchin it sounds like it's a musical instrument, and then elsewhere in Talmud it sounds like it wasn't for music; it was for noise. So the Tosfos Yom Tov says that it's two different things. There's two different magrefas, and David Tzvi Hoffman says that's ridiculous. And the Ravid already has a Harichas where he says that it is the same thing, and he explains how it's both are true. And the maskana from the Ravid is that the taka was more for noise, and it was not part of the music in the Beis HaMikdash. He also quotes Bavram Mishar Aryeh in the Sefer Shiltei Geberim. The Sefer Shiltei Geberim is a very unique sefer that was printed in Italy, in the Shins, where he goes through the whole Yonim of the Beis HaMikdash, but through the lens of whatever modern knowledge they had in Italy at the time. So he tries to identify all the minim of whatever it was, ketairas, things like that were used in the Beis HaMikdash. He has a whole chapter where he treats the treatment of the music in the Beis HaMikdash, where he tries to explain how the music in the Beis HaMikdash worked based on whatever knowledge they had in Italy at the time of music. It was a very interesting sefer. So in that sefer, he addresses the magrefa, and it says, from the Mishnah, it sounds like the magrefa was so loud. So if it's such a thundering noise, then how can that be part of a musical performance? It was not. It was just meant to make a loud noise. So you can't compare it to the organ. And even if you want to say the magrefa is a musical instrument, so the Mordechai Bennett already said there's a big suffix if it was in the Mikdash. And he says his Talmud Rav David Deitch in that German sefer, the orgel in the synagogue. He said he has a raya that there wasn't an organ in the Beis HaMikdash, because it says, Amr B'Shem Gamliel, Lehoya Hadralos B'Mikdash Mepnei Shekarle Av Ma'arbe V'Shane'ima. Has a very thick sound, and it confuses the music. Hydraulis.
Hydraulis happens to be the Roman.
So, what is a hydraulis? It's mentioned footage there in the Gemara. Also in the Yerushalmi, it says Ardablos. That's how in the Yerushalmi, as it's printed at least, that the word got a little corrupted or whatever. It says Ardablos. It's clearly the same word. And it says over there, Amr B'Shimon Balakish, Ugav Ze Ardablos. It actually says that that's the Ugav. And he says, Rabbi Musafia, who's one of the sources for teaching, one of the early sources for teaching foreign words in Chazal. So he says that this is clearly what we know from Greek sources or Roman sources as the hydraulis. And he says that in German today, it's what you would call the Wasserorgel, the water organ. If you look it up today, you'll find online that they say that was actually a confusion. The water organ and the hydraulis are not exactly the same thing. The hydraulis did not use water, it used pumps, they pumped air through it, but you can look it up. It's a lot of interesting information about the history, and you see it's mentioned in Chazal, so it helps you understand Taich and the Gemara. So anyway, he wants to say, the hydraulis is a Vaser organ, and the organ, so it's all the same. And it says in the Gemara, the hydraulis was not in the Mikdash. So here's a guy, you want to say that, we're doing what they did in the Beis HaMikdash. No, you can't say that. It's not in the Beis HaMikdash. And he says, actually, one of them he mentions is Bartholdi, for those familiar with him. He said the Bartholdi and these others, they actually claim that the organ is not a great instrument to use. It actually messes up the music, which Rav David Deitch already mentioned in his Sefer in German. So if the Mikdash didn't use it, so then, and even if they did, we have the rule, the matzeva. The matzeva used to be good, and then it became snua because it was used for Avodah Zarah, so things can always be passed later. Then he gets into the question of Prague. The Matirin say, he spells it al Tanai, going with that reading of the name that the Beis Knesset was made al Tanai. So the Beis Knesset is al Tanai by Prague. They had an orgel, but in Ilkanela Divrei Habris, Rabbi Shraga says he mentions that they had this practice. Tisha Bati Knesset, G'dayla Shebehem Nogel Zamer L'Kabel Shamas B'Klei Zamer. The Chassam Sefer says that we're Mekubal that the Taka stopped singing it before Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbos. And it might be true they even had an ugav, they might even had an organ, but they changed the niggin, they didn't play it in the normal way. And the other shows, they're trying to diminish and minimize to what extent it was used in Prague, which Goldhaber in his article says may or may not be true to the degree they're trying to minimize it. Then he quotes the old Siddur from Taf Lamed Ches, Shlomo Zinger's Nigis, Shiur for Be'ugav u'V'Nevalim. So you see it, a very old source mentioning the ugav. And in the Shiur, it talks about how if you treat Shabbos right, the Geula will come. So that's why, and there's an association there with Chassan and Kala. Shabbos is a Kala, the Eibishter is the Chassan. So if they're matter to be menagim, the covered Chassan and Kala, so there's an association here. We're doing it for the covered Shabbos as well. It's also a shtickl Chassan and Kala. But so they may have done it originally, but some services and they stopped. And Ram Levenstam and Tzarech Chaim says that in Prague, that the show that had the organ, it could be originally it was built with it, and it was before it was such a Christian practice. So once they had it beheter, so then there wasn't Chukas HaGoyim. But then once it's a problem, so then it's no good. And at some point, the Chassam Sefer says they removed it. It gives different svaras. Back then, the churches weren't as into the organ yet as much as they are now. And anyway, in Lavirayim a minute Kehila Achas, the Liskard Hainayim B'fnei Menhogei Shar Kehilas Kadeshis Shaloyde in Relation a minute Kazeh. Why are you harping on this one Kehil? Look at all the Kehillas that don't have this minute, right? So Prague is different. Then he gets into the whole question of Chukei Seyam, and there's different shittas in Chukei Seyam. We're not going to get into it, but there's the famous Ma'arik that says that it has to mamish be something ridiculous, something that is mamish no reason. You're mamish trying to imitate the Goyim, and the Matir and Leigat Tzadek, I think of Aaron Chariner. Try to say that based on this, it's not Meshuna and it's not Pritzas, so it's not Chukei Seyam. But Tzara Chaim already responded that it is a chayk tamua. They only use it in the church. It's not used in any other context, so it seems peculiar to their religious practices. So the argument was that it is chukas hagoyim. And then David Tzvi adds, and even if it's, you want to say it's not mamash chukas hagoyim, but there's also chukas apikarsim. It's also a zach. It says in Gemara Chulin that you shouldn't do certain things by shchita because you're imitating the minim. The minim did the shchita a certain way, and you shouldn't imitate them. And the Gemara connects it, the Brisa connects it to b'chukasayim leiselechu. So even if you can't argue that it's chukas hagayim, if you can make the case that it's chukas apikarsim, since the reforms started, at least over here, and they did all kinds of other things, they changed the tefillas, they're kay from B'yas HaMashiach, and all the other horrible things along with the organ. So for matir that, it looks like we're accepting all the other terrible things that they did. And who knows what else they'll be matir. And in the Soyan Meid experience shows that it never stops with the organ. The organ is step one, and then comes everything else. So he says, I'm not even going to get into the whole question of Churban Beis HaMikdash, whether or not we shouldn't have music now b'chlal, even though some of the German Rabbanim got into that in the Israelit. And he says, and of course, there is an association here. We, as Orthodox, we're very into the Galus, and we believe we're in Galus. And the Reform, part of one of the big planks of their beliefs is that we're not in Galus. Moasu beGeula, and the emancipation, that they got equal rights, that's the Geula Hamitas to them. So that's why they erase everything in davening has to do with Tzion and Yerushalayim. So you see that association here as well, and then of course they're looking to play music. So maybe you see the connection there. And back to the question. The question was though only for Chasanis and for the king's birthday, and we already said it's mutter to play music for Chasanis, and it's mutter to play music for the king. But even if you take a strong position on music otherwise, but. He says, Kol Yirei Shemayim, even on those occasions, should use other klei shir, but stay away from the orgel because it's chukas avodah zarah, chukas apikarsim. Seif davar, you should not be matirit, b'shum oifen, even b'chol. And he says, interestingly, I saw in a sefer that said, Ayin b'sefer hashirim, al dvar nigan hamuzika b'beis haknesas. I assume he means the Shirim Asher L'Shleima Reb Shleima Minho Adumim. I found it in the catalog of Ben Yaakov that there's a psak from Rav Yudaya de Medina against those who are arguing against. As we know, actually, from looking at it, though, it was actually not about musical instruments. It was just about musica in the sense of a choir. So he didn't have access to the Sefer. He didn't have HebrewBooks.org. But we do, and it's actually not especially relevant to the question of the organ, things like that. Now, what about this Rav? This Rav is in a very tight spot, right? We said he's trapped. The Kehillah really is pushing to institute the organ, and the most he can do is try to stop it and confine it to these things on the weekdays. So, Mihu, if there's a Rav, and he wants to insist that you could be matrid for these occasions, and he's Seimech on the Matidim that said it's only Yasser on Shabbos, and he says that it's not for Avodas Hashem, we're not mimicking the Goyim, so it's not B'chukei Seim, it's just for Chassid and Kalam, for the Melech. So if he's Seimech b'shas hadoichek, so b'shvil chet zeh ein bedaiti levatel rishus hatoras heirah shenasati letalmid. If a Rav is going to stop there, I'm not going to revoke my smicha to him, that making him a rabbi. That's where I'm willing to stretch it up until there. But he has to tell everybody exactly what he was matir and why, and make sure no one gets the wrong ideas and takes it further from that. And this is the end of what he wrote in Adar Edition Tafresh Nun Zayin. Then he says, I saw another article about it, and he sent it to different Rabbanim to see what they have to say. He says, I have a haskama from Bezriel Hildesheimer, but Hayan Sha'adavar Udavar Kasha She'enim Mefurish B'Paiskim, and really you can say whatever you want in a sense. On the other hand, it's a Dover Gadol, it's like Didin Afashis. The whole Yiddishkeit is dependent on this question. It means also the Nefesh is simply that the Rav's livelihood is at stake. Does he have to quit and his family, hang out to starve? So, because I'm very, it's a sensitive issue, so I'm not saying Kablu Daiti. I would like the input of other Chachmei Hadar. And then the postscript, it says, I sent this michtav to 5 Rabbanim, Rabbi Ezer Auerbach of Halberstadt, Yomen Zev Feilchenfeld of Posen, Mordechai Amon Hirsch of Hamburg, Mordechai Horovitch of Frankfurt am Main, and Ramesha Ayat Bamberger of Kissingen, and they all answered Le'isser, sounding like they went even further than him and said that it's Mamish Aser, even Chasanis and the Kved HaMelech, except for Mordechai Horowitz, because he heard that Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer had already agreed to David Tzvi Hoffman to not go all the way, so Mordechai Horowitz bowed out of respect for Rabbi Yisrael Hildesheimer. But here's we see that the furthest David Tzvi Hoffman and Rabbi Yisrael were willing to go, and how many other Rabbanim were not even willing to accept that. So that's a sample, and you see David Tzvi also summarized a lot of the material that came before him. So we see again that things are not exactly 100% clear. It seemed like most or almost all the Rabbanim saw there's a danger here, a danger to Yiddishkeit. We have to separate ourselves, but there's variations in how exactly they approach that practically. Just like there were different approaches before reform was an issue. You see different Rabbanim with slightly different feelings and opinions. Now, B'chal, my impression is that not every svara that was raised in the context of fighting the reform is necessarily always a stark svara that applies in every single situation. So, for example, when it comes to the setup of a shul, it seems like, a shtibel from community Lavdafka is looking to be medayik in the seder of a shul. Mashenkin, if you build a big, beautiful shul out of town, and then you might want to be more careful to make sure you're distinguishing yourself from whatever the local reform temple is doing. So that's sometimes how you approach these types of svaras. So derech zehir. Obviously, the Frum community as a whole, music as part of life has already become very much accepted, even though you still might have many Rabbanim that actually never have gotten fully on board with all the concerts and all the musical performances, all those questions about the Gemara and Gittin and all that stuff has never fully been resolved. You'll still find, I guess, different opinions on that. But overall, music is part of life, so no one's really going to get up and say it's usher during the weekday. So then what's to stop you from bringing it into shul? So if it's an actual organ, for those who might still be interested in installing an organ, so that probably everyone would say, chukas hagoyim, chukas apikarsim. Well, let's say someone brings in a guitar and a flute to Hallel. Hard to say one thing or another, even though surely there will be Rabbanim who would not be happy with it. And what if you bring a keyboard into shul? Is that already like a memutza between a guitar and an organ? And what if it's, let's say people have performances in shul outside of davening. Sometimes they even bring a grand piano, which is still not an organ, but even closer. Seemingly it's been done. It doesn't occur to people to say that's reform. Interestingly, every year there's a volume called Tchumen that comes out with halachic articles and halachic topics on relevant contemporary issues from the participation of people from the world of the Rabbanut in Israel and to the left of that. So it's interesting that 3 years later, 3 years ago in Tafshinayin Chas, an issue in Krach Lamed Chas, there actually was a debate, like a formal debate on this question. What should be our official position on incorporating music in shul on these weekday occasions like Rish Chodesh, Chol Hamoed, etc. So someone went through a lot of these Mekayres, and he was malak at all the svaras you could use to say that it's not really okay b'chlal. And that was the argument he tried to make. He tried to make an official argument that our position should be that it's not okay to bring music into shul ever. And there's a response there from a different writer who says, like, no, come on. I mean, he doesn't even really quote that many other sources in response. He just says, these are not compelling, overwhelming arguments. If people want to bring music in, are we going to stop them? So it seems that the status is essentially that as of now, it's still a pretty informal thing. Often it's not even in an established shul. It could be like, they put up a tent and they do it in a tent, things like that. So if it remains on an informal basis, it seems like it's not bothering anyone. But if we suddenly saw normal mainstream shows bringing instruments into davening, it might cause a new reaction. People might not be okay with that, with normalizing it on that type of level. On the other hand, regarding a choir, even though in Italy originally that was the controversy, can you even have a choir and harmony? But that seemed to become accepted in big parts of Europe. You had chazanim with a choir, adults, children, and a number of places can mention it positively, apparently even including the Chassam Sofer. So in those places, choirs had become the norm. But in other places, it seems that it never became the norm. In more Chassidish places, I don't think you find that the big Chassidish shuls, communities, had a chazan with a choir. Maybe I could be wrong. Maybe this depends where. It may have been more of a, more modern shuls were more into the chazanim and the chazanus, and the chazanim themselves tended to not be religious. So it was all part of that, even if it wasn't officially reformed. L'chayra today, it's been forgotten. It's almost unheard of to have a chazan with a choir in stam from shuls. There are exceptions. There are some, modern shuls, the Shabbos Mevarchim. They try to reproduce the old chazanim and the choirs, but it's still pretty much, I would say, on the sidelines if you take the general look over what the shuls are doing today. I just want to. Right. So I just want to mention two more things, B'negei the Rebbeim and something B'negei the United States. So from the Rebbeim, I did not find a lot on this topic. I found two things from the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab in the Rishimis of the Baruch Shneir, he writes that he was sitting by the meals of the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab was sharing different anecdotes. The Rebbe Rashab said he once traveled to Rome. The Rebbe Rashab definitely had different travels around Europe. He once ended up in Rome because he had some curiosity regarding the Klei HaMikdash. He wanted to see if he can find out anything about that. And they told him that the Rav of Rome is the one to talk to. And where's the Rav? The Rav is in the synagogue. And what kind of synagogue is it? So the Rebbe Rashab calls it a karshel. Kar is a choir. That's the term, like a karshel, oivei. Plus it's a karshel, so the Rebbe Rashab couldn't go in because it's asr al pi adin to even be there, because it's made lahavdil, like their base tiflasam. The chazan stands there beside us, aruchos, like the koimrim, and everyone there isn't davening b'chalal. So that's a karshel, and you can't go into there. And in the conversation, the Rebbe Rashab turns to his granddaughters, the daughters of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Bnei Harayatz, and he says, "She'aser afilu l'shmoya stam chazan she'eni rei shamayim kedaboy." Can't listen to any chazan who's not 100%. Mikol shekein leilach lekarshol afilu bakrai ba'alma. You can never end up in a karshol, even incidentally, even if you're maybe the Beis Harav was a little bit into culture on different levels, but that's not the culture you can participate in. And there's more on that over there in the Rishimis of Baruch Shneir. He elaborates even more. So it's not clear, he keeps on calling it a karshel. Is the psol taka the choir, or he mentioned other things. He didn't mention that the choir per se is the problem, or was that just a shem nerduf in the Rebbe Rashab's milieu, apostle shul, automatically that was the nickname, a karshel. Another interesting source I found is that Rabbi Shmuel Munschein published in Kvar Chabad a translation from the book Lebanon Kampf von Yidden in Tsarish in Russland, 1905 to 1917. It's printed in Paris, 1968. It's the memoirs of Yitzchak Schneerson. Yitzchak Schneerson was a Rav Mitam, a government rabbi in Chernigov, and not a particularly Orthodox one. He was also the secretary at the Ve'idas HaRabbanim. They had the famous gatherings of Rabbanim in the early 1900s in Russia, and this is about, so Munschein translated the chapters about the Sifas HaRabbanim in 1910, which the Rebbe Rashab participated in and starred in. This Yitzchak Schneerson is also the brother of Professor Fischl Schneerson, who you may have heard of, you're more likely to have heard of. They were both the children of Shneer Zalman of Starodov, who was a Rav, and he was the son of Sholem Ber of Rechicha, however you pronounce it, who was one of the Rebbes from the Kappas dynasty. He was in turn a son of Maril. So he describes the Sifas HaRabbanim 1910. He says, I want to describe a certain event. He describes different characters of Chaim Brisker and the Rebbe Rashab, and it's all there by Arichas. I wanted to describe an event that happened where which increased the excitement surrounding the Kinnos. He says it was the day of the Kinnos, and they invited all the representatives to Shachris in the synagogue. And as was the practice under the Tsar, they were supposed to have a prayer for the Tsar and to express their loyalty and their fealty and to promise that the whole Asif will be conducted in line with the Tsar's wishes and fairly. So the guests of the Kinnos came to the Kabbalah's Panim, and they were greeted by the Gaboim of the synagogue and other characters, representatives of the Jewish community in Petersburg. The Chazan and the choir sang very nicely. It was beautiful, but there was one participant in the Asifa who was a no-show. Who was that? And that was Rabbi Rashab, the Rabbi Milubavitch, however he writes it in Yiddish, the Lubavitch Rebbe. So rumors immediately spread that not only had the Rebbe Rashab not showed up, but the Rebbe Rashab had said that a synagogue with an organ, with the organ b'chalal, v'gam menagnam bo b'yom HaShabbos, it's not a base knesses and it's not a base medrash. This can show b'chalal, so it doesn't exist or whatever. He's not coming. So the rabbis and other religious Jews enjoyed the pachim panim that the Rebbe Rashab gave to because apparently he was the only one who didn't show. Everyone else was cowed and showed up. But they enjoyed to see that the Rebbe Rashab is giving it to the Freie. But the representatives of the Kehillah and the Gabayim were very upset and they felt very insulted. And they kept on trying to delay the ceremony, and they were conducting negotiations behind the scenes with the Rebbe Rashab to see if they can somehow still get him to come. And they asked him, they said, do you think our shul is not a shul? Is our davening not a davening? Is the Kaddish not a Kaddish? Very emotional argument. And the Rebbe Rashab gestanden bei Zayntz, and he said, Hashem is about Rachmim, V'rachmim v'kol masov. He writes in that your tefillas, if in fact you are davening, should be heard by the Rebbeinu Shalom. I wish you luck, but for me, it's not a base medrash, and I won't go there. And this caused tremendous storm. Some scream that the Rebbe Lubavitch is a fanatic, but the Chassidim and the Charedim were very, very happy by these developments. And even the Freie, even the Poikrim, however he writes it in Yiddish, respected him as someone who was proud and someone who had dignity, who can stand up for his beliefs. And that strengthened the Rebbe Rashab's position in the rabbinic world. I'm not familiar with any sources that touch directly on the question of music, Bechlal, and Shol, Slichos. I'm not aware. If anyone knows of anything, I'll be happy to hear about it. One final thing about the history in America, there's an interesting history relating to synagogues and organs in the United States. This is based on an article by Dr. Yitzchak Levine in the Jewish Press, which is in turn based on an article that was printed about this in the publications of the American Jewish Historical Society. In 1749, there were Jews in Charleston, South Carolina, and they opened their first shul synagogue called Kodesh Beis Elokim. And they very soon, once reform came on the scene, you had these tensions within the synagogue. So in 1825, there was within the synagogue, the members made the Reformed Society of Israelites, and then they dropped it in 1833, but then in 1840 they became active again, and they brought a petition to the Board of Trustees of Beis Elokim, signed by 38 members, where they said we want to have a discussion about installing an organ. And they had an ally in the Chaz and the Cantor. His name was Gustavus Poznański, sounds very Polish. He had been hired in 1837. Now, those in charge of Beis Elokim had interviewed him, and they tried to make sure that he was in line with Orthodox Judaism, and they were happy at the time. But by 1840, by 3 years later, he had switched sides, and in fact, the shul was burned down or rebuilt, and all of a sudden he announced that, we're rebuilding the shul, I'm in favor of installing an organ in the synagogue. So they had a meeting about this on July 26, 1840. 90 members attended. Got very heated. They passed a motion to invite Poznański to come and say his piece. Poznański came, and he said it would be great. And there are some authorities, probably quoted Neugat Tzedek, he had some authorities to quote that it's a great idea. So the chairman, Nathan Hart, was against this. He tried to declare a resolution in favor of the organ out of order, but that attempt failed. We're familiar now with the machinations in Congress and the Senate, so it might sound a bit familiar. It was passed by a vote of 46-40. So the traditional members were stunned, and they said 46-40 does not meet the synagogue's constitutional requirement, because synagogues back then had constitutions with the types of rules like this. They've been printed. If you look, you can find interesting constitutions, constitutias of various shuls online. So it did not fulfill the constitutional requirement of the shul that any ritual alteration requires a 3/4 majority of members present at the meeting. But whatever argument, it didn't help. And in 1841, they introduced the organ. So Nathan Hart, some were telling Nathan Hart that he should take out an injunction. He should appeal to courts of law. but he didn't do that. They threatened, but then Nathan Hart and someone else, they passed away very soon afterwards. So they decided to just remove themselves from Beth Elokim. They started a new congregation called She'erith Israel. So now the reformers are completely in charge of Beth Elokim. They started introducing other changes, Yud Gimel Ikrim, and Sidrei HaTfilah, etc., etc. And they were going so far that even the more moderate reformers in Beth Elokim, who had been happy about the organ, but they were getting horrified by how things were getting out of control, like Melamed Lahayel says, he never stops at the organ. So they tried to make a compromise, but things weren't. But then, 1843, Poznansky gave a drasha where he said we have to change even more things, and that's when things really came to a head. And now the remainder of those in the synagogue split into two: those against for and against Poznansky. They proposed a resolution that would require them to follow all of Torah, that they should follow Torah loyally. And it failed. It was a very close vote, 27 to 24. So they said, hey, if it's this close, if even the reformed Israelites of the Shul are split 27-24, let's bring back all the members who left the synagogue a few years ago. We'll certainly have the majority. So they brought them back. They claimed they never had formally withdrawn from their membership. So 34 members rejoined. And on tonight that we have to restore the davening to the way it was before the organ, and we have to build a mikveh, and no chazan can be appointed if he has sympathy for reform. And this attempt to retake control caused tremendous fights. And they granted the membership to those 32. The reformers said this is a hostile takeover, the vote is invalid. And it ended up in the Charleston Court of Common Pleas. So this is how an organ and a shul ended up in South Carolina courts in the 1840s. It went to this court, and then it went to the Court of Appeals, and they decided in the favor of the reform group, and that the membership of these additional members was invalid, and that's how that legal case ended. And that's the history, and so you ended up having, She'erith Yisrael ended up remaining a separate, more Orthodox synagogue, and the reform kept control of Beis Elokim. I want to conclude with a tshuva written in America by Moshe Feinstein, and as I was preparing this, I discovered that this tshuva of Moshe is written to none other than my grandfather, my mother's father. He should live and be well. Igris Moshe Eira Chaim Chelik Beis Simon Lamed. There's a letter from Tafshin Chaf Aleph to Milas Kvod Yedidi Hanichbad Reina Rav Reb Gershon Rafal Rotstein Shlita. My grandfather was born and grew up in Portland, Maine. This is also relevant to the Mikvayos discussion when we get back to that. But he grew up in Portland, Maine, which was at that time a very chashuv kehillah. Of course, there are many more Yiddish kehillas that were spread out throughout the United States at the time. He was born in the 40s there. He was raised there, and then when he was quite young, Mashiach came and said that it's very nice to be from, but without a yeshiva, there's no future, there's no hope. So he and his older brother were sent to Torah Vadas in Brooklyn when they were 7, 8, 9, 10, very very young, and big beautiful mishpachas came out of that. So apparently I was Mavar this morning on the way here, and apparently this is Tafshel Chaf Aleph, so he was about 20 years old, so he must have returned home to Portland. And in Portland, the big synagogue was Sharet Tfilah, and Sharet Tfilah, so it was Orthodox, but American Orthodox. So, for example, there were mixed dancing events that sometimes took place in ballrooms, and sometimes they took place in the shul. Maybe they put up a mechitza in front of the Aron Kodesh or something, but they had events like that. And he wasn't sure, as a Talmud of Torah Vadas, is this an Orthodox shul or not? Not quite sure, right? Anyone can call themselves Orthodox and take down the mechitza and put in a mic. So, those were the questions at that time. The line was often very thin, so he reached out to Rav Moshe, a personal question, and Rav Moshe said, where they also make parties, and anoshim. So if it was mitchila, they had a mind to do this, so then, according to me, he's mitzayin to a different shuvah, it's not a shul b'chlal, because it's built into the etzim binyan that it's for taruvas, it's not a shul. But if it was l'chatchil v'kedusha beis haknasa, so then even if they introduce the teyevis afterwards, you can't remove the kedusha. So it's just us to continue making these parties. But and he says even if it is kavol the teyevis, if azman mu'uchar, if it's late and you're there and you won't go somewhere else, you could daven there, even though the tefillah is not mekubelas b'makom zeh, but you're not patur from tefillas, even if it was nikba melachatchila. I believe, it doesn't say here, I'm assuming that it was not nikba melachatchila when they opened it in 1900 whatever for Rikudim Tarevis, so I'm assuming it wasn't that bad. And then he says, "V'tvara klei zemer sheichnisu." They brought instruments into the shul as well. So av shurak l'shtamish boy b'haparties, v'loy b'shas hatefillah. It was only just for the entertainment, not for davening. But it's pastish for the shul, because Zimra, the Mana Asr, he's citing the Gemara and Gittin that musical instruments are Asr outside of, maybe for Dvar Mitzvah, yes, but otherwise, Shalei Dvar Mitzvah, and he's Mitzvah into his tshuva on that, the Ramesh has a tshuva on that whole general question. Parties, Elu, even if they're for a fundraiser, even if they're, let's say, Kibbutz Mois, L'Tzedakah, it's still a Dvar Isser, and you can't be matir music at such an event. And if it's a klei zemer shemishtamshin b'bati tifla, so if it's an organ, aser gam mishum chukas hagoyim ayin b'chsam sefer. So that was what Rav Moshe had to say on the question of musical instruments in Bechlal and an organ in particular in the shul. He also mentions about the simchas bas mitzvah, that you shouldn't do it in a shul, etc.